Welcome to Lecture 10, Victory, Judgment, and the New Exodus Salvation, where we look at Revelation 14:1 to 16:21. This lecture will happen in three parts. This is part 1. The spectacle in the arena of Revelation's dramatic visions continues as the victorious Lamb arrives with an army of purified saints and overshadows the grim scene of the beasts, the seduction and subjugation of the crowds, and the enactment of the exploitative economy. Accompanying the arrival of the Lamb are three angels who announce both the necessary response of reverencing God and giving to Him glory, and the severe consequences of judgment for continuing to resist this demand. These consequences reveal that the judgment will be complete and total. For now, the final septet of judgments in the bowls of wrath, the full part of heaven, earth, and sea will be affected, and the conflict will result in a final battle at the place called Harmageddon. These judgments are referred to as the passionate fury of God's anger, which will be complete at their conclusion. This raises a challenging and often uncomfortable question for those who embrace Revelation as Christian scripture: the problem of graphic violence and punitive retribution. Admittedly, this is not a problem for all Christian believers. Some revel in the brutal imagery of bloody retribution on the wicked and the warrior-like fantasy of Christ slaughtering impudent rebels. There are some Christian believers who relish a good revenge fantasy on those wicked non-believers who make easy targets. John, as we shall see in our survey of the next chapters of this dramatic work, complicates matters and weaves a tapestry, or a gallery of tapestries, where dialectical tensions between just judgment and merciful hospitality refuse to be swallowed up into the other. Before we survey the content of these chapters of the Apocalypse, we will consider some of the charges of indecency leveled at the Apocalypse, and consider further the metaphor of the arena that has occupied our study from the battles with the dragon in chapter 12 and throughout the next few lectures. An introductory reflection on the violent spectacle and rhetoric of the Apocalypse. The graphic images of violence have been a cause for several readers to be repulsed by John's visions, and even to accuse him of betraying his Christian heritage. In this section, we will consider some of the concerns about the violent imagery of Revelation and what this means for the theological, ethical, and moral considerations of the community of faith that receives this text as the final installment of the canon of Scripture. We all should listen closely here. Christians should not too easily dismiss the concerns. Skeptics should not too easily consign this text as irredeemable for moral character formation and a robust ethical and political vision, even for the contemporary era. The challenge of violent imagery in the Apocalypse. Steve Moyes says, certainly the Lamb is its key Christological title, but the characteristics attributed to it are hardly those of self-sacrifice and vulnerability. For example, in the chapter that follows Revelation 5, the destruction brought about by the opening of the seals leads people to seek death rather than face the wrath of the Lamb, Revelation 6, verse 16. The beast may do all sorts of despicable things to God's people, but none compares with Revelation 14, verse 10, where God's enemies drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of His anger, and they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Had such a statement been written about the beast, commentators would have described it as the epitome of malice, vindictiveness, and evil. David Barr, it is wrong to read John's story as if it were about divinely sanctioned violence. We can recall from the introductory lecture how many expressed disgust and revulsion at the many of the disturbing images from Revelation. Writing about common contemporary views concerning apocalyptic and dystopian visions, Robert Eustra and Allison Wilkinson state, we tend to think of apocalypse not as comfort or consummation, but as senseless brutality and punishing anger. It is both of those phrases, senseless brutality and punishing anger, that turn Revelation into a fulmination of fear and a menace of bully preachers, not to mention fuel for the crisis of conspiracy theories. Judith Kovacs and Christopher Rowland opened their survey of the recent history of Revelation, noting that in the popular view, apocalypse is about cataclysm, death, and destruction, or the end of the world. It offers images that convey the magnitude and malignity of our experience, not only at a national, international, and social level, but in individual lives as well. In the company of these dreadful associations, it is no wonder that the book is so often relegated to impenetrable mystery or wielded by fire and brimstone pulpiteers. However, the violent imagery is not the same kind of challenge for everyone who reads Revelation as the capstone of the Norma Normans, that is, the rule of rules of Holy Scripture. Some readers relish in the prospect of unadulterated divine vengeance. Among them are surely the authors of the runaway best-selling Left Behind series. Controversial preacher and former pastor of Mars Hill in Seattle, Mark Driscoll, promulgates an MMA champion vision of gospel machismo. He says, in Revelation, Jesus is a prize fighter with a tattoo down his leg, a sword in his hand, and the commitment to make someone bleed. This is a guy I can worship. I cannot worship the hippie diaper halo Christ because I cannot worship a guy I can beat up. It remains unclear how Driscoll understands the Jesus of Revelation 19, to which he alludes, might relate to the slaughtered lamb of Christ in Revelation 5. Is that not precisely a Jesus who was beat up in Revelation 5? That is, the lamb who was slaughtered? On the other hand, many commentators are repulsed by what New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan refers to as the pornography of violence in Revelation. Crossan writes, it is one thing to announce, as in Mark's little apocalypse, that is, the Gospel of Mark chapter 13, that there will be a spasmic paroxysm of human violence before the returning of Christ. It is another thing to announce, as in John's great apocalypse, that there will be a spasmic paroxysm of divine violence by the returning Christ. The first coming has Jesus on a donkey making a nonviolent demonstration. The second coming has Jesus on a war horse leading a violent attack. We Christians still have to choose. In conclusion, therefore, the book of Revelation is the Christian Bible's last and thus far most successful attempt to subsume the radicality of God's nonviolence into the normalcy of civilization's violence. But as Christianity follows John in emphasizing the second over the first coming, and apocalypse over incarnation, it finds itself waiting for God to act violently while God is waiting for us to act non-violently. To turn the non-violent resistance of the slaughtered Jesus into the violent warfare of the slaughtering Jesus is, for me as a Christian, to libel the body of Jesus and to blaspheme the soul of Christ. The violence is not just directed toward Roman or pagan outsiders. Many perceive here also a sexist, misogynistic violence in the depictions of sexually charged characters. We will consider this claim in more detail in the next lecture that considers the imagery of the whore of Babylon in Revelation 17. There are male warriors who are also virgins remaining undefiled by women, Revelation 14, verse 4. Most famously, perhaps, there is the contrast between the whore of Babylon and the bride of the New Jerusalem. Again, Crossan comments, the venom of the book's anti-Roman rhetoric is especially for internal rather than external effect. It intends to preclude any Christian cooperation with the Roman Empire, although John believes that collusion is already happening. John is advocating virginal celibate asceticism as the Christian ideal, and his whore language may reflect the misogynistic vision of one who is male rather than the celibate vision of one who is free. In a later book called How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian, opening with a chapter whose subtitle is A Hymn to a Savage God, Crossan recounts question and answer sessions after giving presentations at churches where his audiences objected to his articulation of a nonviolent ethic for the historical Jesus. Christian believers, it seems, craved a prize fighter as much as Mark Driscoll. Crossan recalls, "No matter what I said about the nonviolence of the first coming, questioners objected that the second coming was to be supremely violent, was to be a war to end all wars." Put bluntly, the nonviolent Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount seemed annulled and dismissed by the later Jesus in the book of Revelation. For Crossan, even the paradisiacal scene of the final redemption of creation and the new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21 are sullied by the pathway of trudging through the ocean of blood in chapter 14, and Christ the bridegroom as slaughterer and vanquisher leaving a mound of corpses in 19. At the very least, the acts of divine intervention and retribution rouse an awareness that the ethical appropriation of John's visions must make a decision at the fork in the road between violent and nonviolent spiritual formation. Paul Middleton, who rejects the nonviolent readings of the Apocalypse, after surveying some of the more colorful revulsions at Revelation's violent metaphors, opines, Revelation has been attacked for its violence, its misogyny, for departing from Jesus' teaching to love one's enemies, and for offering a poor vision of future justice. Perhaps it is its vile obscurantism that has helped forge Revelation's negative reputation. Arguably, its very opaqueness makes it the least distant book of the New Testament. Its lack of firm historical reference means any generation who wishes to decode its message can read themselves and their enemies into its narratives of angels, beasts, whores, and heroes. Precisely because the Apocalypse directly involves both the cognitive and affective aspects of the human psyche, should give us pause in order to reflect about how our personal traditions and our local congregations, not to mention individual readers, preachers, teachers, and other influential interpreters, are performing the scripts we are perceiving in the text. To put a finer point on the questions we are wrestling with concerning Revelation's characterization of Christ, that is, its Christology, and its ethical vision, that is, its morality, we ask, ultimately, does the lion lay down with the lamb, or does the lamb look like a dragon? Or, in the terms of Revelation's moral political vision, does the Lamb truly conquer violent and idolatrous Babylon? Or is he himself ultimately overcome by Babylon's ethos of violence, which results in destruction rather than redemption and redemptive purposes and creation life? Is it actually the case that the kingdom of our God and his Christ has become a kingdom of this world? Contrast the statement in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 15. The opening statement of this section by Steve Moyes highlights both the challenge of the violent imagery, at least at the surface, and the double standard by which Christian believers often read the Bible. What would cause us to recoil in horror if an action was attributed to the beast becomes an opportunity for an apology on behalf of divine prerogatives if the same action is performed by God or God's sanctioned enemies. The problem for Moyes is the open range of possible interpretations that cannot be controlled by the author of the text. For example, he argues, the lion-lamb juxtaposition involves mutual interpretation and not simply one element, the lamb, replacing another, lion. After surveying some strategies for addressing various elements of the interpretive task, Moyes tentatively concludes with an air of ethical ambivalence. He writes, "Thus, I am completely in favor of reinterpreting the military imagery of Revelation in a non-military way. But I am skeptical of those positions that confidently tell us that this is what John intended, or that this is the proper reading, literary reading of the text. The relative instability of the lion-lamb juxtaposition, given the amount of violence with which the lamb is later associated, is a constant reminder of how easily the oppressed can become the oppressor. Readers might adopt a view that the end justifies the means. The lion-lamb juxtaposition is not so stable that readers are forced to reinterpret the apocalyptic violence in a non-violent ways. The juxtaposition allows a nonviolent interpretation, but it also reveals a fundamental danger, namely that the weapons of resistance can end up supporting the very values being resisted. It does not do justice to the book of Revelation to advocate a position where lamb simply replaces lion. Evil is much more complex than this. So recognizing the openness for many possible interpretations is not the same thing as affirming all readings. We are well aware by now that Revelation is a complex and complicated book with many reversals, which invite audience participation to imagine a transfer of status and power. David Barr, who is responsible for the other epigraph at the beginning of this section, indicates the risk involved in the depiction of such reversals and raises the specter that transfer does not always stipulate transformation. In interaction with Moïse, Barr writes, "For just as John reverses the characterization of the emperor from hero to villain, so he reverses the characterization of Jesus from the conquered victim to the conqueror. He becomes the divine warrior." That such fiery torture, referring to Revelation 14, verse 10, can be envisioned is horrible. That the Lamb can be envisioned as a spectator to it is beyond horror. And it gets worse, for one must raise here the specter of coercion. Humanity seems left in the impossible situation that the beast will kill all those who do not worship it, and God will kill and torture all those who do. It seems a fine line between killing to induce worship and killing because of worship. The ultimate value in this story seems to be power. Power exercised ruthlessly. One even has the sense that God is willing to engage in torture in an effort to induce humanity to repent. One may wonder whether the torment induced by the presence of the Lamb should properly connote torture, but Barr does accentuate the potential menace of the exercise of power when there is an opposition of wills, the volition of God's rule, and the exertions of the unruly dragon. Stephen Moore, writing in a decidedly post-colonial vein, articulates the challenge in startling terms that expose the vulnerability of Revelation's anti-imperial critique. It is worth hearing out Moore from an extended quote reflecting on the possibility that Revelation's challenge to Rome's empire failed precisely by matching fire with fire. Stephen Moore writes, "In its concern to maintain intact the high-walled partition separating imperial metropolis and Christian periphery, Revelation, although passionately resistant to Roman imperial ideology, paradoxically and persistently reinscribes its terms, to the extent that Roman imperial ideology, like subsequent European imperial ideology, itself pivoted around an interrelated series of dualistic distinctions between metropolis and periphery, civilized and barbaric, and so on. Of course, Revelation maintains the metropolis-periphery binarism only in order to stand it on its head. The hierarchical power relations that currently obtain between metropolis and periphery, Rome and nascent Christianity, are soon destined for spectacular reversal. The world empire has become the empire of our Lord and his Messiah, quoting Revelation 11:15. Were the tightly sealed elements on each side of the binary opposition allowed to leak into each other, conceptually speaking, a simple reversal of the hierarchy would not be possible. Activities or ideologies that do not conform to the binary separation, therefore, such as participation of Christians in the imperial cult, are subjected to censure or rendered taboo in Revelation. But the inherent stability and untenability of the binary division come to be displaced expression in the elaborate mimicry that characterizes Revelation's depiction of the other empire, that of God and the Lamb. Mimicry that persistently blurs the boundaries between the two empires until it becomes all but impossible to say where one leaves off and the other begins. The divine empire that Revelation proclaims is neither separate nor independent from the Roman Empire. Instead, the former is parasitic on the latter. In due course, however, the host absorbed the parasite, precipitating the host's mutation into one monstrosity that the seer of Revelation seems incapable of imagining, an empire that is Roman and Christian at the one and the same time. But the curious phenomenon of Constantinian Christianity itself bears monumental testimony to the fatal flaw in Revelation's ostensibly anti-imperial theology. The fact that it counters empire with empire. To proclaim that the world empire has become the empire of our Lord and his Messiah is also to proclaim that the empire of our Lord and his Messiah has become the world empire. More than any other early Christian text, arguably, Revelation epitomizes the imperial theology that enabled the Roman state effortlessly to absorb Christianity into itself, to turn Christianity into a version of itself, and to turn itself into a version of Christianity, notwithstanding the paradox that Revelation is also ostensibly more hostile to Rome than any other early Christian text. Stephen Moore continues, he says, the flaw in Revelation's theology inheres in three mutually reinforcing features of the text. First of all, the throne is the paramount metonym for God in this book. Second, the principal attributes of the one seated on the throne are stereotypically imperial attributes: incomparable glory and authority, absolute power, and punitive wrath. And third, the principal activities of the one seated on the throne and those of his elite agents are quintessentially imperial activities: the conduct of war and the enlargement of empire. To construct God or Christ together with their putatively salvific activities from the raw materials of imperial ideology is not to shatter the cycle of empire, but merely to transfer empire to a transcendental realm, thereby reinscribing and reifying it. The product is an imperial divine amalgam or essence that is extremely difficult to dismantle or dislodge. Ultimately, however, if Christian theology is to be intellectually as well as ethically adequate, and as such less luridly anthropomorphic and less patently projectionist, might it not require what Revelation locked as it is in visions of empires and counter-empires, emperors and counter-emperors, is singularly powerless to provide a conception of the divine sphere as other than the empire writ large? This challenge from Moore cuts right to the heart of whether or not John's vision about God's kingdom can truly transcend the violence and destruction of self-aggrandizing politics and impugns the God of Revelation as one more version of humanity making God in its own image. Even more than this, Moore's hermeneutics of suspicion here suggests that John opened the door for a compromise between the community of God's people and the political ploys of the beast so as to undermine any coherent strategy of resistance against idolatry and to concede the entire arena to the destroyers of the earth. Moore seems to suppose that power itself must necessitate violence. Can Moore be correct in his contention? De Villiers seems to agree when he writes, though Revelation appeals to its readers to be nonviolent witnesses, it does so through harsh language and power claims. It is language that stands in serious tension with the pronouncement in the Sermon on the Mount that even a single word like raka can be violently harmful. See Matthew 5, verse 22. Even more so, this is language that soaks the imagination of readers in violence. Such language, as contemporary sociolinguistics points out, potentially can be more destructive than physical violence, especially where it is sanctioned by religion. It is language that draws its listeners into an atmosphere of bitter and agonistic opposition against others, and that categorizes people in terms of either good or evil with dangerous consequences. Certainly, this is hyperbolic and lacks precision, for it is precisely the result toward physical violence that causes the rhetorical rancor of othering one's opponents to be so damaging. Words can hurt, but mere words are simply smacking of lips until they are translated into political policies and social practices that bring dehumanization. Robert Royalty offers a similar assessment, echoing the various attempts to exonerate or explain away the violent imagery of Revelation's protagonists. He writes in his conclusion, "Opposition to the dominant culture of the apocalypse is not an attempt to redeem that culture, but rather an attempt to replace it with a Christianized version of the same thing." The text creates a new culture of power that mimics the dominant ideology. Only the names and labels are changed. Revelation replaces Rome with a new Jerusalem and Caesar's court with God's, but the underlying power structures are essentially the same. The point of this rhetoric is not the redemption of the world or even the Christian community, but the establishment of a new theocratic empire. Ultimately, Revelation constructs a theology in which ideological judgment is at the heart of the gospel message. The good news proclaimed is that the faithful slaves who have endured have a place in the golden city, and that their evil opponents do not. For those who oppose this ideology, the text offers judgment with no justice, crisis without catharsis. Clearly, for royalty, judgment means condemnation and even execution. Royalty has postured himself in opposition to the explicit ideological vantage point of Revelation that declares that God's judgment is in fact just and righteous. This is so in 15:3, 16:5, 19:2. One might wonder if there is no rectitude for the innocent victims, and if there is no differentiation and separation between the victims and the perpetrators, can there be justice? And can there be catharsis? If requiring change and transformation is itself violence, then there can be no escape. And the concerns about violence per se must evaporate, or at least be reformulated in terms of appropriate violence or the legitimation of certain kinds of violence. One may suggest that, in spite of all the insights royalty may proffer, his critique has not delved far enough into the dynamics of power and how Revelation is aware of the dangers of opposition and judgment. Harry Meyer describes a different possibility of construing the reception of Revelation's ideological grid pertaining to the cross as a divestment of divine power, and the stakes of reading Revelation in the 21st century in accordance with the prophetic vocation of Christ's church. Again, we'll listen to an extended citation. The end of Christendom names more than a parochial reality. It describes the social world challenging any person who wants to take seriously the abiding value of tradition and ethics in the modern world, who wants to be more than a grazing and fertilizing consumer. The end of Christendom signifies a secular, allegedly narrative-free world. The task of the sideline Christian church in Western secular society is not to transform or manage culture, but to trouble it. At the end of Christendom, the Christian church exists to insist that the troubling story of the cross insist on the troubling story of the cross, and to form this world believers who contribute to and enrich secular pluralistic society through lives of spirited public witness to the God incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, who reveals a way of being human on terms other than the insatiable desire for more military domination and national security. This, I argue, says Meyer, is the God John's apocalypse reveals, even, paradoxically, in its most militaristic and triumphalist episodes. For John, the cross as instrument of Roman execution reveals political despotism and the ruin covered up by an imperial facade of peace and prosperity. From the perspective of the cross, imperial successes are seen from a new vantage point. The cross insists on a hermeneutic of suspicion, a truly critical reading of our most important ideas. The apocalypse urges a contemporary first world church living amid the peace and prosperity of contemporary empire to continue this cross-elevated suspicion. Even as Revelation discovers life and power in a way of witness to its unlikely counter-imperial hero, Jesus, the slain Lamb, so does it trouble the contemporary church into asking where it finds life. Reading Revelation calls for the church to confess the divestment of divine power in the self-emptying of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross and God's act of raising him from the dead. It urges a life immersed in what I will call costly testimony, a contra-present witness to God's self-revelation in a powerless slain lamb. The book of Revelation urges its audience to believe that in the life of the slain lamb, what opens before us is a gift of and call to a strikingly new way of being human. The gift of being human puts believers on a collision course with competing invitations to becoming human, in particular those that result in environmental waste and human degradation in return for the material promise of an insatiable consumer culture. In place of an invitation to conspicuous consumption, Revelation urges conspicuous generosity. The vocation of this way of being human is to express the lavish self-giving of God in the most routine features of everyday life and ethical decision making, even if, especially if, that brings it into direct conflict with pungent religious discourse from the public sphere. Too often muzzled by the strict separation of church and state, consigning religion to the private recesses of the human heart, North American Christians have for too long been silent and willing participants in a consumer culture that degrades us all. John urges us to be troublemakers by teaching us the power of public confession of belief. If the churches are looking for transformation, here they will find it. Only then will we find the courage to envision new ways of being in society and face the fact that we no longer inhabit the balls of privilege. More seriously still, such courage may lead us to repentance for the idolatrous misapprehension that we could ever have comfortably sat in the halls of economic pragmatism, even as they brought us into direct contradiction with our gospel identity of God's lavish expenditure for the world. Such reorientation will require us to seek forgiveness for transforming the theology of the cross into social triumphalism. The book of Revelation's demand is to learn to be more marginalized, edgier disciples leading lives of costly testimony, rehearsing in order to reverse, enthroning so as to decrown, setting up only to knock down. Revelation unmasks the masquerade of tyrannical political power and urges its hearers to walk a more costly way. Meyer suggests a remarkable shift in both the consideration of power dynamics and the reorientation of the hermeneutics of suspicion. Here, suspicion is directed toward the reader's horizons over those of the text, and the world in front of the text is unveiled as less stable and in more need of repair than is often recognized by institutionally supported academic interpreters of the text of Revelation. Again, Christians, we should reiterate here that Christian believers should not be immediately dismissive of these concerns from professional scholars, and the academic should not concede too quickly to the impulse of ideological zeal to vanquish the voices of ecclesial interests. Instead, we should give careful attention to the details of the language and rhetoric of the apocalypse itself. In a subtle and nuanced article considering the rhetoric of violence in Revelation, Susan Hyland considers the ethics and politics of interpreting the metaphors of violence against the common impulse in scholarship to reduce them to a nonviolent propositional message, challenging those whose ethical sensibilities desire to interpret the violent images, such as the ocean of blood in Revelation 14:20, or the conquering rider on the white horse in 19:11-16, or the massacre leading to a feast of vultures in 19:21, or the lake of fire associated with torment day and night forever and ever in 20:10, as having a non-violent meaning that can be embraced in a modern world oversensitized to the religiously motivated brutality. Hyland argues that the violent content of Revelation's metaphors is not magically transmuted into something nonviolent. Instead, she argues that Revelation employs multiple metaphors and images, some violent, others docile, poised in an irreducible tension and interfering with each other's simple logic of juxtaposition and transference. Hyland engages in a complex discourse about metaphors, responsive to sociolinguistic and philosophical developments, and the manner in which metaphorical expression is not merely flowery or superfluous speech. Rather, we can identify many conventional metaphors, for example, time is money or argument is war, which structure entire conceptual systems and shape both thinking and action. Armed with this observation, Hyland expounds upon the power of metaphor to shape the imagination by engaging the audience's worldview with a certain kind of reasoning. The imagery of conquering, for instance, brings with it the implications of a zero-sum game where there must be winners and losers. She explains, "Yet to say that the Lamb's conquering is metaphorical is not to say that it is nonviolent. Understood as multiple metaphors, the images of lion, root, and the Lamb, from Revelation 5 she's talking, do not cancel each other out. Each contributes to the overall meaning. Because all of these metaphors are necessary to portray Christ in this complex way, the reader cannot simply negate the violent part and still say that the Lamb has conquered. The conquering of the Lamb, even a nonviolent lamb, rests to some extent on the logic of lion-like conquering. The lamb does not magically transform the lion into something nonviolent. From the standpoint of an interpreter concerned about ethics of this violence, the tension created by the images may be important. Taken on its own terms, the logic of one metaphor interferes with the logic of the other. The lamb's death is described as conquering, and the lion's conquering is that of the lamb standing as slaughtered. The lamb does not mute the violent imagery. The juxtaposition of multiple images, however, may bring the logic of violence into question or even reverse normal expectations of what conquering looks like. By resisting the urge to alleviate the tension, Hyland proffers a resilient ethical proposal that refuses to defang the lion in the face of modern hypersensitivities to the imagined violent ends. She writes, "In complex moral situations, reading the language of Revelation as multiple metaphors may provide resources for cultivating moral decision-making. To suggest that John's vision is only nonviolent may go too far and may be unproductive ethically. The violent metaphors of Revelation have been part of what has allowed the text to continue to speak in meaningful ways in situations of oppression. Thus, reading Revelation's language as multiple metaphors may be ethically productive because it asks the reader to be aware of the complex interplay of values and norms, not simply to choose between the two options, violence and nonviolence. The interpreter's job is to understand the larger values or norms that are in play and often in tension. In light of the suspending rhetoric of the apocalypse hurling us toward an inevitable end that never comes, this approach is promising, even if not satisfying, for those who want to determine and package the correct answer for the disturbing images of Revelation and its incursions into the realm of justice, the good, the true, and even the beautiful. Theologian Miroslav Volf takes seriously the concerns about the dangers of violent rhetoric, which often gives way to the realm to real physical, social, and political violence. Volf demonstrates a keen sense of how easily the followers of Jesus can long for the apparent security that was promised by Rome's military prowess. He writes, "In a world whose order rests on violence, we instinctively grasp for the resurrected Messiah who was given all power in heaven and on earth." See Matthew 28:20. Not that we find no use for the crucified one. We only insist on a clear division of labor between the crucified one and the resurrected one. The crucified Messiah is good for the inner world of our souls, tormented by guilt and abandonment. He is the Savior who dies in our place to take away our sins and liberate our conscience. He is the fellow sufferer who holds our hands as we walk through the valley of tears. But for the outer world of our embodied selves, where interests clash with interests and power crosses sword with power, we feel the need of a different Messiah, a different kind of Messiah. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who will make our wills unbending, our arms strong, our swords sharp. Superimposed on the image of the helpless Messiah hanging on the cross is the image of the victorious rider on the white horse, his eyes like a flame of fire, and his robe dipped in blood, coming to tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty, quoting Revelation 19:11-17. We will believe in the crucified, but we want to march with the rider. Without Caesar's sword, we feel truth and justice will not reign. But as we long for Caesar's sword, we should not forget to ask whether truth and justice will reign with Caesar's sword. How can truth and justice be anything but deception and oppression to those who have been brought to insight by violence? Will they not reach for the sword themselves to establish their truth and their justice? As violence erupts, oppression and deception hold sway. New imbalances of power will be generated and profound disagreements over truth and justice perpetuated. And this will be done by big and little Caesars, wielding their large and small swords. In such a world, our question cannot be whether the reign of truth and justice, that is, the reign of God, should replace the rule of Caesar. It should. The sooner the better. Our question must be how to live under the rule of Caesar in the absence of the reign of truth and justice. Does the crucified Messiah have any bearing on our lives in a world of half-truths and skewed justice? Volf displays here the recognizable self-searching penance of a prophetic church that is all too aware of the failures of church history, the Crusades, the Holocaust, the lynchings, the genocides that have been endorsed and perpetuated by church leaders and members who were all too certain of their righteous cause presumed to be endorsed by the eternal judge. However, Wolff explores the violent rhetoric of the apocalypse not in search of a non-violent message hidden underneath, but precisely arguing that Revelation deploys images of violence in order to undo a violent order. Wolff does not mince his words, but asserts that this requires accepting John's ideological perspective that God's judgments are just. The flip side of this means that we take sin seriously as sin, naming it as such, and recognizing it as an affront to God and God's desire for creation. Wolff explains, at the core of the Christian faith lies the claim that God entered history and died on the cross in the person of Jesus Christ for an unjust and deceitful world. In taking upon himself the sin of the world, God told the truth about the deceitful world and enthroned justice in an unjust world. When God was made sin in Christ, thinking 2 Corinthians 5:21, the world of deceit and injustice was set aright. Sins were atoned for. The cry of innocent blood was attended to. Since the new world has become a reality in the crucified and resurrected Christ, now 2 Corinthians 5:17, it is possible to live the new world in the midst of the old in an act of gratuitous forgiveness without giving up the struggle for truth and justice. The cross of Christ should teach us that the only alternative to violence is self-giving love. Willingness to absorb violence in order to embrace the other in the knowledge that the truth and justice have been and will be upheld by God. But Wolff states plainly the apparent contradiction when we get to the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19. He writes, "What about the rider on the white horse who seems to deploy violence without any thought of embracing the enemy? Is he not the same suffering Messiah who was all along secretly dreaming of revenge and has now finally come to take it with a fury? Does he not come to pour out the wrath of God Almighty?" Revelation 19:15. Does not heaven rejoice at the sight of the destruction of Babylon in Revelation 18:20? Do not the saints gleefully cheer from the sides, "Render to her as she herself has rendered, repay her double for her deeds, mix a double draught for her in the cup she mixed"? Revelation 18:20. Is not the veritable orgy of hatred, wrath, and vindictiveness on the part of those who like to see themselves dressed in white robes a final victory of revenge over love? Of violence over non-violence? Had John of Patmos, who saw Jesus Christ as a lamb standing as if he had been slaughtered, taken a better look, would he not have seen a bloodthirsty beast? And so, even this theologian, proclaiming the message of the cross and propagating an ethos of Christian discipleship, recognizes how thin the line appears at the seams of the tapestry that is unraveling the web of Babylon's empire only to weave on the loom of God's eternal kingdom. Yet, Wolff does not back down from the risk, but intrepidly presses into the imagery of violence, declaring, much like the God of the whole Bible, the God of the apocalypse is an eminently political divinity. The God not only of individuals and their families, but of kingdoms of this world. A non-indignant God would be an accomplice in injustice, deception, and violence. Wolff disputes the possibility of a non-indignant God in the face of innocent victims and a world plagued by genocides, war crimes, rapes, and human trafficking. Wolff then describes the conditions for the expression of divine violence. He offers a personalized and existentializing reading of Revelation's criticism of evil in the image of the beasts of chapter 13. He writes, "Underlying the theology of judgment in the apocalypse is the assumption that nothing is potent enough to change those who insist on remaining beasts and false prophets. Certainly most of us are not beasts, though the beast can all too easily be awakened in us. Most of us are not false prophets, though we so easily fall prey to the charms of propaganda. We should not, however, shy away from the unpleasant and deeply tragic possibility that there might be humans created in the image of God who, through the practice of evil, have immunized themselves from all attempts at their redemption. Ensnared by the chaos of violence which generates its own legitimating reason and goodness, they have become untouchable for the lure of God's truth and goodness. God will judge, not because God gives people what they deserve, but because some people refuse to receive what no one deserves. If evildoers experience God's terror, it will not be because they have done evil, but because they have resisted to the end the powerful lure of the open arms of the crucified Messiah. Wolff takes a noticeably Protestant turn here in his considerations of judgment. Rooting his theological claims about judgment, redemption, and the possibility of salvation in the Christocentric accomplishment, Wolff bespeaks of the single criterion of divine judgment in the world, the cross of Christ, as a bestowed gift awaiting reception by a lost and sinful humanity. Unlike many in the Western evangelical tradition, however, he does not reduce the salvific efficacy of Christ's cross to simply individual salvation. After all, the cross is not forgiveness pure and simple, but God's setting aright the world of injustice and deception. The polarity is there because some human beings refuse to be set aright. Those who take divine suffering, the cross, as a display of divine weakness that condones violence, instead of divine grace that restores the violator, draw upon themselves divine anger, the sword, that makes an end to their violence. The violence on the rider on the violence of the rider on the white horse, I suggest, Wolff says, is the symbolic portrayal of the final exclusion of everything that refuses to be redeemed by God's suffering love. For the sake of the peace of God's good creation, we can and must affirm this divine anger and this divine violence, while at the same time holding on to the hope that in the end, even the flag bearer will desert the army that desires to make war against the Lamb. The day of reckoning must come, not because God is too eager to pull the trigger, but because because every day of patience in a world of violence means more violence, and every postponement of vindication means letting insult accompany injury. Waiting for the evildoers to reform means letting suffering continue. The logic here satisfies both those concerned about God's inactivity to address injustice and also those who might balk at unfairness and inequity for opportunities for self-expression. But one might wonder if the final move is a violent retribution for the recalcitrant opponents, if God's sovereignty must surrender to the sinister regulation of a baleful compulsion. Does violence determine the final strategy for the divine purposes? Wolff rejects this prospect. He says, does violence then have the last word in human history? Is overpowering the last act of God in the original creation? No. The judgment against the beast and the false prophet is the obverse of the salvation of those who suffer at their hands. God can create the world of justice, truth, and people only by making an end to deception, injustice, and violence. The purpose of the judgment is not the deadly calm of the final disclosure, but the eternal dance of difference that give themselves to each other in a peaceful embrace. The end of the world is not violence, but a non-violent embrace without end. The most surprising thing about this book is that at the center of the throne, holding together both the throne and the whole cosmos that is ruled by the throne, we find the sacrificed lamb. At the very heart of the one who sits on the throne is the cross. The one to come is ruled by the one who on the cross took violence upon himself in order to conquer the enmity and embrace the enemy. The Lamb's rule is legitimized not by the sword, but by its wounds. The goal of its rule is not to subject, but to make people reign forever and ever. Revelation 22:5. With the Lamb at the center of the throne, the distance between the throne and the subjects has collapsed in the embrace of the triune God. A certain kind of violence is inevitable when people have responded to the freedom bestowed upon them in God's creation with rebellion. Wolff presupposes a radical freedom and a genuine choice imbued within the created order. However, this does not mean chaotic anarchy where God becomes dissociated from the destiny of this creation. Violence is necessary if there are wills and volitions that choose against the goodness and truth of the way of God, the way that God proposes for God's creation. The vision across early Christianity, including within the apocalypse, is to boldly proclaim God's monopoly on violence. The option is never made available to the followers of the Lamb in history or in the eschaton. Wolff explains, Christians are not to take up their swords and gather under the banner of the rider on the white horse, but to take up their crosses and follow the crucified Messiah. The close association between human nonviolence and the affirmation of God's vengeance in the New Testament is telling. The suffering Messiah and the rider on the white horse do indeed belong together. They are not accomplices in spilling blood, but partners in promoting nonviolence. Without entrusting oneself to God, who judges justly, it will hardly be possible to follow the crucified Messiah and refuse to retaliate when abused. The certainty of God's just judgment at the end of history is the presupposition for the renunciation of violence in the middle of it. The divine system of judgment is not the flip side of the human reign of terror, but a necessary correlate of human nonviolence. Since the search for truth and the practice of justice cannot be given up, the only way which nonviolence and forgiveness will be possible in a world of violence is through displacement or transference of violence, not through its complete relinquishment. In a world of violence, we are faced with an inescapable alternative, either God's violence or human violence. Most people who insist on God's nonviolence cannot resist using violence themselves or tacitly sanctioning its use by others. In this way, we see that the theologian who affirms Revelation's violent imagery arrives at a similar conclusion to the sociologically oriented critics who denounce it as merely a relic of John's ripe or rotten tribalism. It would be premature for us to settle the issue before considering all the episodes on the docket. It would be unwise for us to attempt to domesticate the God who sits on the throne, or to muzzle the lion who is a lamb, or lamb who is a lion, when they remained unrestricted and undetermined by the masticated scroll of John's unfurling visions. Instead, we will consider the broader context of the culture of spectacles in Asia Minor in order to sneak a preview of what it means to give a performance of the apocalypse in the theater of God's glory. Framing violence, the spectacle of blood in the arena. Harry Meyer says the apocalypse is a visual feast. Long after the last curtain call and the echo of the cry for an encore, apocalyptic performance dies away. It is a sense of being watched that lingers. Perhaps one awakens in the middle of the night with a strange feeling that eyes are fixed upon oneself and that there can no longer be any secrets. Or on the way to work the next day, one steals a glance over one's shoulder for fear of being followed. This epigraph here, citing Harry Meyer's rich and complex study Apocalypse Recalled, the Book of Revelation After Christendom, is indicative of the ambivalence that modern scholarship has in awakening to the reality that John's vision creates an atmosphere of surveillance. The risen and exalted Jesus has blazing eyes of fire in 1 verse 14, which are 7 spirits that see all throughout the earth in Revelation chapter 5 verse 6. As John watches the procession of images flash before our eyes through the record of his apocalyptic epistle, he imparts the realization that it is the audience who lives under the watchful eye of God. This is not a mere spectacle of entertainment. The apocalypse is a drama incurring participation through the experience of it. It is not simply that the audience is reading Revelation. Revelation is reading and evaluating the audience, scripting them into roles as aficionados of the seductive regime of the beast or as devotees of the Lamb's subversive kingdom. As Meyer quips, the apocalypse offers scripts for a self who is aware that it is on stage. To experience Revelation is to enter the arena. To enter the arena nullifies neutrality. As the drama rushes toward the final curtain, the unveiling hails an everlasting encore that is discriminating and decisive, a city whose gates are always open, Revelation 21:25, but where not every character is welcome, see 21:26 and Revelation 22 verses 3 and 15. John lived in a conspicuous culture. The pervasive undergirding values of honor and shame meant that everyone lived through everyone else's eyes. The social competition for honor and shame brought with it a ritualized hierarchy of social relations where opportunities to increase one's honor were as ubiquitous as natural resources. Often, as Rome expanded its imperial ambitions and the cities of Asia Minor competed for honors to be recognized for their fidelity and gratitude to Rome and its imperial benefactors, the incursions of Roman spectacles were eagerly received. There was a fusion of Hellenistic and Roman cultures in the vast spectacles that bathed the theological and socio-political imaginations of the inhabitants of Asia Minor in John's day. However, with the Romans came a distinctive form of visual display, victory art, art showing conquest and war inspired by the Roman triumphal procession. In his book, Spectacles of Empire, Monsters, Martyrs in the Book of Revelation, Christopher Frillingos examines how Revelation shares in, reflects, and reprises this culture of spectacle. Rome utilized the public spaces of temples, markets, that is the agora, theaters, and such, to propagate a particular identity for the peoples within the borders of its determined spaces. The script of its imperial vision was carved into friezes, inscriptions, monuments, and coins. Public knowledge was transmitted through festivals, religious processions like those of the imperial cult, and in public spaces like the arena and the theater. The gladiatorial games, that is the munera, beast hunts, venationes, and public executions of the condemned, the noxi. As Eric Gunderson concludes in an article examining the ideology of Rome's arena as a means of monopolizing cultural images of power, he writes, nearly every major theme of Roman power structure was deployed in the spectacles: social stratification, political theater, crime and punishment, representations of civilization and the empire, repression of women, and exaltation of bellicose masculinity. Donald Kyle, in his examination of Rome's voracious appetite for public death, spectacles of death in the ancient Rome, opens with this remark for a study that will examine unnatural public death at Rome, the intentional, orchestrated, and spectacular killing of non-loved ones, the slaying of humans, and the slaughter of beasts seen as foes, outsiders, outlaws, threats, or prodigies. Our subject, writes Kyle, is life-taking violence allowed or ordered, sanctioned, or staged by the state in public areas. For Romans, this killing was not clandestine, nor was it to be ignored. The killers, the killing, the dying, and the dead were all to be seen. As Seneca protested, Romans saw the turning of a man into a corpse as a satisfying spectacle, satisque spectaculi. In fact, the dedicatory inscriptions for the earliest known amphitheater, that at Pompeii of around 70 BC, calls the facility a spectacular. Away from the battlefield, Rome killed at home in sacrifices, festivals, gladiatorial combats, proscriptions, and executions. The famous spectacles of the arena were largely expanded, embellished versions of earlier forms of killing, adapted for the comfort and entertainment of the spectators. The allure of violence and death was not unique to classical Rome, but Rome reveled in killing as in the thrills and the reassurance, the self-validation of a love affair. Death became a spectator sport at Rome. These sentiments are echoed by Alison Futrell in her book, Blood in the Arena, The Spectacle of Roman Power. She argues that the munera, the gladiatorial combats, depicted Rome's violence as having turned inward, a rhetorical performance aiming to display symbolic power and masculine virility. The mythos of Roman statehood was on full display in the amphitheater, also known later as the Colosseum. Frillingus notes how the arena becomes a premier site for viewing others and putting oneself on display. Frillingus explains, crowds of Roman subjects beheld not only the glory of Rome in its distinguished representative, but also their place in the social system as they lined up to view the procession according to a hierarchy of age and status. In the provinces, local elites, not the Roman emperor, sponsored the spectacles, fulfilling thus part of the social gift-giving obligations that rich and powerful individuals possessed. In Asia Minor, Roman-style entertainment arrived in the province as an extension of the imperial cult. Populations in the Greek East embraced the Roman shows. They were not simply about making Roman colonists living abroad feel at home. The gladiatorial duels, like the shrines of the imperial cult with which they were often associated, were sponsored by local Greek elites who delivered these performances against the background of an entrenched Hellenistic aesthetic. The physical settings that housed Roman spectacles in this region, for example, betray little Roman or Italian architectural influence. And the Roman amphitheater, while represented occasionally, did not replace the Greek theater in Asia Minor. Rather, existing Greek-style theaters were modified to hold spectacles. A high wall around the orchestra pit, for example, was built in Ephesus to protect spectators from the wild beasts on display. This is precisely why the arena, as well as the theater, for it mirrors the same dynamics, is such an apt metaphor for the rhetorical effects of posturing the audience in such a fantastic and fantasizing work like the Apocalypse. The sands of the arena and the scenes of the stage provide more than mere visual objectification. They also become the context for the audience to view itself in the figures and characters being displayed. Listen again to the words of Harry Meyer, who also perceives the dynamics that Frillingus is describing. The Apocalypse also scripts for itself, for a self who is aware that it is on stage. In the book of Revelation, one encounters contemptible profiles and those worthy of emulation. These characters offer staged shows of the end. As characters take their part in various scenes, they lift before their audience a series of roles to play and actors with whom to sympathize or to reject. In visions of beatitude and torment, one sees alternative endings played out. A hortatory strategy of the apocalypse is to convince its audience that when it beholds these endings, it is witnessing itself. Staged in apocalyptic narratives, Revelation positions or reveals the members of John's audience as they really are, or displaces or masks them, dressing them up as mythical, larger-than-life characters, or casting them in legendary narrative. Through parodies of social interactions, his hearers discover themselves distorted in a play of mirrors, as a series of more or less grotesque actors more or less grotesque actors as a series of more or less grotesque actors interact and enact what John reveals as the truth about his listeners and his hopes for them. John invites his audience to side for or against these characters, to be moved by their performances, to be persuaded of his message, and to pursue his goals. In the drama of the apocalypse, the line between stage and audience, between observer and observed, is fluid. The audience watches. It also discovers it is part of the show. In the visions that follow, the listeners will learn how to act out their parts, and some will discover themselves dressed in disturbing costumes, or worse, in the costume that is no costume at all, nakedness. In the songs and laments of these visions, in the responses to calamity and persecutions, John's listeners discover idealized stories that provide scripts for performing in a Christian social world. In an earlier article, Meyer argued that the visions of judgment in the apocalypse are intended to undermine the present temporal order. The Christian message lives the entirety of their existence. The Christian lives the entirety of their existence along with all creation under God's eye, which will become a powerful motivation to live according to God's wills and laws. Meyer argues, the visions of impending judgment undermine the present temporal order of the world by presenting parodic sketches of heretofore unsuspecting or recalcitrant sinners now suffering apocalyptic torment. Such horrifying parodies, parodying lives of vice, seek to motivate the apocalypse's audience to find its way, through obedience, to the apocalypticist's alternative, happier ending. In the course of these unfolding scenes, the audience also comes to see its own destiny. To the degree that the apocalyptic literature portrays a world of imminent woe or beatitude, their audiences move about a stage performing roles of either faithfulness or apostasy. Dressed up in apocalyptic costume, audiences not only see themselves, but more importantly, encounter themselves as God sees them. The very self of the audience member is fronted, framed, and formed by the characters portrayed in the unveiling visions. More than this, the social order is refracted through the lens of the focalizing exhibition. One learns one's place by viewing the world as it unfolds before the eyes. Even the seating in the theaters and stadiums was allocated and arranged by social status. Inscriptional evidence found at Ephesus indicates that the city council, the boule, the council of elders, the gerousia, the youth association, the ephebes, and the tribes, the phules, main speakers, the theologians, had their reserved seats. One learns what to desire and how to achieve it by the dramatic action performed on the stage. Again, Kyle explains this well, writing, Marshall claimed that the game showed imperial power and control even over nature. And with the variety and multitude of species and races involved, the games were a microcosm of the territorial extent and imperial majesty of Rome. Like festivals, processions, drama, and games in other societies, spectacles were ritualized performances that communicated, restored, consolidated, and sometimes helped change the communal order. Not mere entertainments or distractions, they were systems of meaning or cultural performances by which sociocultural orders, that is, values, norms, status relationships, were formulated and reformulated. The different categories of public spectacle also bespeak the appetites for civic viewing. These exhibitions displayed a mix of the familiar and the strange, precisely in order to represent the world and to reinterpret the world with its clear boundary markers between insider and outsider. Those who belong with us versus those who are like them. Identity and belonging are communicated and reinforced from the vantage point of the arena and the theater, capturing the strange and the exotic and displaying it on stage, whether it be a foreigner who awaits execution or a bizarre creature from distant lands. These exhibitions reinforced the social order. The public executions utilized several means of ways for the convicts to die, such as by the sword, the damnatio ad gladium, and being tossed to wild beasts, damnatio ad bestias, all of which drew upon Greek and or Roman myths to imbue the death with the significance of creating and maintaining order against the threats of chaos. The Apostle Paul himself could appeal to the attention-grabbing prospect of being thrown to the wild beasts at Ephesus in 1 Corinthians 15:32, almost certainly as a metaphor for public conflict. So, like the staging in the arena, the apocalyptic theater frequently positions and displaces its audience in scenes portrayed by mythical actors who are larger than life. More than this, the apocalyptic drama contends for a separation from the enemy, especially if it is a terrifying monster or a morally corrupting deviant. Alison Futrell explains how the configuration of the opponent as an atrocious other serves to elicit condemnation and self-protection. She writes, "The narrative form of the violent performance may direct the audience reaction to it. The different context of the performative violence affect response more than the simple presence of a gratuitous act of bloodshed. Theatrical performances provide an analogy. Tragic violence, in which the spectators sympathize with the victims of unjust, unrelieved violence, may evoke a cathartic reaction, while melodramatic violence, with a simplistic portrayal of victims as deserving of their fate, is likely to promote a very different response, to serve as a catalyst for the audience's bloodlust. When the victim is demonized or alienated from the empathy of the audience, the viewers identify instead with the perpetrators of violence, gaining an intense feeling of satisfaction, even joy in their vicarious revenge upon the victim. Seen in this way, the arena spectators were meant to participate in the punishment of the performer. They were his judges, inflicting the fate he merited, both by his marginal status and by his actions in the arena. The possibility of this bloodlust extending beyond the controlled environment of the amphitheater was something that greatly concerned the Roman state, as indicated by the prompt and severe official response to the riot in Pompeii. The munera achieved special prominence in the late Republic when Roman political competition reached new levels of ferocity and violence. The gladiatorial games can be interpreted as replication of this turmoil, with a crucial distinction: the violence of the munera, with stylized, purposeful, highly ordered, and under the strict control of the editor of the games, Over time, as the Munera came under imperial auspices, the central government clearly indicated its intention to control all aspects of the gladiatorial complex. The structure imposed on the arena was symbolic, at a number of levels of the order imposed on the Roman Empire. The shedding of blood was done in an orderly fashion, placed in a ritualized context, with all participants, spectators, performers, and producers playing out their expected roles. The form taken by the performance was significant as well. The structured gladiatorial combat evoked certain basic elements of Roman ideology. Thus, there is a containment of the violence and an inscription and re-inscription of a social order that is carefully choreographed for the purpose of defining roles, identities, and their corresponding fates. Gunderson also describes the world that the arena creates and how the viewing of the spectacles imbues the audience with a kind of power over the exhibition, all while themselves being guided and managed by those who are directing the games. He writes, "The sand itself can be read as symbolic space, functioning to represent a select, idealized version of the empire to its audience." As far as geography was concerned, Rome was a small point at the center of a vast empire. The physical relationship was inverted, however, on the day of the shows. An orderly construct of Roman society ringed its own empire, contained, controlled, and choreographed. The arena then proceeded to educate Romans about the contents of their empire. Augustus, like Julius before him, made it a point to display new animals and all sorts of marvels in the arena. Captured tribes were made to fight en masse. Claudius reenacted the surrender of the British kings. The Esadarius, that is, a gladiator who fought from a chariot, inspired by a foreign style of fighting, even became a member of the fixed roster of types of gladiator. The comforts of such a situation are obvious. An imagined Rome is given an impossible vision of the substance of its empire, and its elements are brought in as totally subjected. Their significance, their alienness, their objective otherness can thereby be easily confronted and overcome, given their situation within the confines of a stabilized, orderly ring of Romanness girding them. Those dying in the sand have been exiled into the non-Roman space. Their sufferings are those of the uncivilized world. In a sense, the populus Romanus is not even the agent of destruction. Beast, fellow criminals, or fellow gladiators are the overt agents. Agents of that other world and not the Roman state. Only in the case of the gladiator does overt Roman authority enter into the ring. The judgment of the editor governs the victorious gladiator's final acts, and it decides on the fate of the iugulium, the slaughter, or the missio, mercy for the loser. But the editor himself is immediately engaged with the popular will. He may variously assert his relationship to the people's will by thwarting it, acceding magnanimously, reluctantly, yielding to a vocal faction, or the like. The principle of legitimating mediation at once interferes with any conception of the direct enactment of the will of the people, or a simple notion of survival of the fittest. Thus, the ideologically fictive populace and the constructed space of otherness cannot interpenetrate without the personal intervention of a Roman nobilis. Only within such a configuration can the populace be granted a voice. Thus, here as well, we have a reproduction of an essentialized location for the Roman nobility, through whom alone the body politic can legitimately act. In every case, the Roman spectator has affirmed for him the ideology of the might of Rome, and of Rome as the opposite of barbarity. Gunderson here focuses on Rome's self-presentation and the communication of the identity of the participating, spectating Roman populace However, also implicit here is the message presented to those others who function as the symbols of savagery and barbarism. Kimberly Stratton presents an essay where she takes the insights of both Futrell and Gunderson, among others, for the rhetorical scripting of those others. Stratton writes, "The propagandistic potential of the arena for displaying power was fully exploited by savvy emperors, who employed spectacles of violence to demonstrate their own sovereignty, majesty, and ultimately power over life and death of Roman subjects. The emperor became emperor, and Rome became Rome through self-presentation and performance during the games." Significantly, much of this self-construction involved the inscription of subject peoples and nations as barbarians and other. Futrell, for instance, asserts that when the victims of violence were configured as other through costumes of ethnic features that marked them as either servile or foreign, spectators identified with the perpetrator of violence, deriving satisfaction from witnessing just punishments or revenge. In Rome, social worth was demonstrated graphically by the sanctity and integrity of elite bodies versus the vulnerability and indignity of lower class bodies, especially those of slaves and foreigners. The arena thus offered Roman citizens the opportunity to experience their collective superiority and civility by viewing conquered foreigners paraded like strange animals and slaughtered in violent spectacles. Exportation of the arena throughout the empire brought this same message to conquered peoples. Foreign spectators seated in the bleachers assimilated themselves to Roman notions of social order and superiority. They allowed themselves to be interpolated as colonized subjects through their participation in the unifying imperial cult. In this way, when the populace of the cities of Asia Minor participated in these public spectacles in the arenas, and the more common makeshift arenas of the theaters, as Frillingus was quoted above, then we can understand how they were participating in their own subjugation, both viewing the other as internalizing Roman subjects and becoming the subjugated through this very spectating. Participation as a spectator creates complicity and lulls the audience into the ideological vantage point of the imperial power grab. Since it comes as entertainment, the surrender is even enjoyable and an occasion for celebration. If these ideas and practices and allegiances could be ingrained through a public participation in imperial spectacle, then they could be uprooted, and the fertile soil tilled and replanted with seeds for a different social and moral vision by the purging power of the apocalyptic performance. John's vantage point is superior even to the local nobility, the senatorial aristocracy, and the imperial throne. John claims a front row seat from the perspective of the divine throne as his angle on the activities and episodes of his visions. The arena of the theater has become contested space for radically opposing visions. The lines have been drawn in the sands. The curtain has been called, and the dramatic plot line is underway as John leads his audience through the discoveries and reversals that make up a good plot for an inspiring narrative that will arouse in the audience the appropriate response to the conflict between the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of the Lord and of his Messiah. We are now suspended between the assuring proclamation of the arrival of God's kingdom and the onslaught of the dragon's campaign against heaven and its beast assault on those who refuse to acquiesce to its demands for worship and receive its mark in order to exchange with its commerce. Before we conclude our intermission and return to the spectacular action, we should consider how the apocalypse itself has a dramatic shape and theatric ethos for the adherents of devotion to the Lamb. performing the martyrological drama in the theater of God. "All the world is a stage," said Jacques in Shakespeare's As You Like It. Kevin Van Hooser says, "Theology is not merely theoretical, a matter of information and the intellect, but also theatrical, a matter of forming, transforming, and performing habits of the heart that lead to action, that is, to works of love. Indeed, there's something intrinsically representational and thus dramatic about doing God's will on earth as it is in heaven. The as provides a warrant for thinking about the church's embodied interpretation as a performance that seeks to represent on earth the rule of God as it is in God's own realm. How then should the people of God perform in accordance with the Scriptures?" And Harry Meyer says, "The apocalyptic theater frequently positions and displaces its audience in scenes portrayed by mythical actors who are larger than life. In the course of these unfolding visions, the audience also comes to see its own destiny. The staged gaze of the apocalypse unmasks and remasks, teaching its audience a way of seeing and behaving as readers, hearers who pursue the traces of themselves reflected in various disguises and fictional interactions." The rhetorical framework of posturing the audience of the apocalypse helps us understand that the implied audience of the messages from the 7 churches in Asia Minor that are addressed in Revelation chapters 2 to 3 are themselves performing their acts of faithful resistance to or complicity with the violent and exploitive economy of Babylon on a bigger stage, with a primary audience of the one who is on the throne and the heavenly entourage. More than this, as the dramatic scenes unfold, the majestic throne of the royal divine court will transform into a great white throne of a judicial courtroom venue. The actors are performing their roles as a spectacle before God and the divine evaluative judgment which has condemned the regime of the beast and its adherents. As Meyer avers, apocalyptic eschatology, existing with narrative, offers scripts for performing a self which is aware that it is on stage. As characters take their part in various scenes, they offer their audiences a series of roles to play, and actors with whom they may sympathize or reject. To the degree that apocalyptic literature portrays a world of imminent woe or beatitude, their audiences move about a stage performing roles of either faithfulness or apostasy. Dressed up in apocalyptic costume, audiences not only see themselves, but more importantly, encounter themselves as God sees them. In the discussion of the arena above, we already saw that the Roman arena, with its vast variety of spectacles and exhibitions, has made its way to Asia Minor and had affected the culture that surrounded John's historical audience and infiltrated the social and moral visions of society. Penetrating the political, economic, and religious spheres as they were inextricably intertwined. The real world of the space-time, flesh and blood, brick and mortar cities of Asia Minor are translated into a cosmic setting by the biblicizing depiction of John's apocalypse. Christopher Frillingus likens John's language to Edward Said's Orientalism, where the stereotyped object, Edward Said's Orientalism, where the setting of the scenes becomes a character in a matrix of values, construals, and configurations of stereotyped objects, recognizable by those who are inducted into the system of signs. Commenting, for instance, on the depiction of the great city in Revelation chapters 11 and the harlot of chapter 17 and the burning city of chapter 18, Frillingus explains, the shocking series of events, which culminates in an earthquake, takes place in a strange, unnamed, and unfixed location. Rather than decide the identification, the allusions to both cities, Babylon and Jerusalem, overdetermine the meaning of the narrative setting. The story slips between two geographical points of reference, Rome and Jerusalem, both of which lie a great distance from Revelation's audience in Asia Minor. With mundane boundaries erased, the city becomes an arena. The entire cosmos has been absorbed by the city, and thus the entire cosmos bears witness to a universal, amazing spectacle. Like a set of concentric circles, the beastly spectacles of chapter 17 and the fall of Babylon of chapter 18 are finally enclosed within an encompassing arena, cosmic and imperial. Now, John presents the familiar world of his audience as if it is like one of the theaters or stadiums of the cities to which he writes. The plausibility of the frame of reference for the Roman arena is likely from the physical features of several of the cities to which John writes. Several of these cities had vibrant theaters, which had crucial social and political functions for civic life, including Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Laodicea. Pergamum had the steepest theater in the ancient world, able to hold up to 10,000 people and having a portable stage. The famous theater of Ephesus, into which the riotous crowds of silversmiths gathered to protest, according to Acts 19, verses 21 to 41, could hold about 21,000 people. Smyrna's theater could hold up to 16,000 persons. Several cities had stadiums functioning as entertainment venues, including Ephesus, Smyrna, and Laodicea. According to Mark Wilson, gladiatorial combats and animal fights were also held at Ephesus, Pergamum, and Laodicea, with Ephesus being the first site in Asia where this brutal sport was introduced in the year about 70 BC. There were gladiator schools, ludi, at Philadelphia, Smyrna, and Pergamum. Pergamum was the only city in Asia Minor to have an amphitheater, which was used for gladiatorial combat. Roland Worth indicates that gladiatorial games are known to have taken place in the stadium at Laodicea as far back as 50 BC. For Cicero makes reference to them and would subsequently be sponsored by the imperial cult, among others. Furthermore, the graffiti found at Ephesus and Smyrna attest to the fact that the gladiatorial combats had drenched the imagination of the populace, for this inspired them to draw images of those contests. Along with the agonistic feature of Revelation, there are several aspects to the text that also reflect features common to the dramas that would have been performed in theaters. Already indicated above are the colorful costumes of the pageantry of many of the exotic and extraordinary characters, such as the dragon, the beasts, the angels, and, as we will see in the upcoming chapters, the redeemed virgin followers of the Lamb, the harlot Babylon, her lovers among the kings, not to mention the rider on the white horse and the stunningly adorned bride. Even some of the artistic features of Revelation gesture toward the context of the theater. For example, Revelation is a noisy book, punctuated by singing, accompanied by instruments, particularly the kitara, seven-stringed harp. Song and music accompanied the Hellenistic dramas with the chorus, whose voice functioned as a hermeneutical voice to guide understanding of the dramatic action. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza has suggested that the singing of the heavenly songs of worship have a hermeneutical function similar to that of the Greek chorus in dramatical plays. Schussler Fiorenza writes, "These auditions throughout Revelation in chapter 5, 7, 11, 12, 15, and 19 have the same function of commenting on the dramatic action and of guiding the perception of the audience which the choir had in the classical drama. By juxtaposing visions and auditions of salvation with those of the anti-divine powers, the seer seeks to persuade and motivate his audience to make their decision for salvation and for the world of God in the face of the destructive power represented by the beasts and Babylon as symbols of Rome." There have been a few notable attempts to consider the dramatic context of Asia Minor's theatrical performance as background to the delivery of the apocalypse. Perhaps most notable is John W. Bowman, who perceived a sevenfold structure of 7 acts, each containing 7 scenes. He declares, John's book is constructed on a twofold plan, that of both a drama and a letter. The dramatic character of the apocalyptic literature, like that of the prophetic rhapsody before it, is one of its most characteristic features, and the dreams and visions which mark its pages are intended to serve as signposts indicating the movement toward the great divine event at the end of history. The Greco-Roman stage suggested to him, to John, a new dramatic form in which to cast the gospel message which it was his wish to present. Another author, James Blevins, went so far as to script Revelation as a drama that he aimed to perform at the theater in Ephesus, where he claims is the only stage building excavated with a 7-panel window. He draws the following conclusion. Thus, for nearly 300 years before the writing of Revelation, the number 7 had acquired great significance for the inhabitants of Ephesus. The main purpose of these windows was to effect presentation of scenery in the Greek drama. Painted panels were placed in the windows depicting scenes too difficult to perform on stage. This suits well many of the scenes in Revelation. Influenced by Bowman's proposal about a 7-act drama, each having 7 scenes, Blevins punctuates the basic theater stage with 7 panels for each scene. What we might refer to as the stage was a complex of many integral parts. Immediately in front of the audience seating was a semicircle of the orchestra, which was the primary performance space for the chorus. Then, the stage proper was various elements of the skene, of the location of various scenes or backdrops of the play. In front, before the orchestra, was the proskenion, and above was the episkenion. The actors would have moved around on the logeon and in the orchestra. Blevins imagines that the orchestra as the Blevins imagines the orchestra as the throne room of God, with the heavenly entourage of 4 living creatures and the 24 elders. Bowman suggested a somewhat different version where each aspect of the scenes of the heavenly temple in the Apocalypse could correlate to the aspects of the Greco-Roman theater, when he wrote, if we replace respectively the skene, proturon, and the proskenion with the sanctuary, or Holy of Holies, the paraskenia with the great white throne, and the 24 elders of the 24 thrones of the 24 elders arranged in a semicircle fashion on either side of it, the customary pagan altar, which stood in the foreground on the level with the orchestra, would be the altar of sacrifice. And then, as occasion requires, conceive of the other furnishings mentioned, lampstands, altar of incense, sea of glass, and a fire, etc. As introduced onto the cosmic stage, we appear to have in these apparently enigmatic sections the required stage furniture for John's cosmic drama. This would perhaps be more appealing if there were evidence of an altar, the tumele, of the orchestra areas in the theaters of Asia Minor, as there are, for instance, in the theater of Dionysius in Greece. Bowman was impressed with the use of visual clues to mark the different scenes for those not explicitly numbered by the septets. He observes that John uses introductory terms such as edon, I saw, ophthe, it was seen or it appeared, and edexon moi, it was shown to me, to change the scenes. The chorus would enter via the parados on either side of the skene. Blevins imagines this to happen as early as the first hymn passage in Revelation 1, verses 6 through 8. This would inaugurate the drama of 7 acts. One more recent attempt to imagine what it would take to stage the apocalypse as a drama comes from Sylvie Raquel. She explains the appropriateness of the dramatic context for considering how the visionary rhetoric of Revelation is received as performance. She writes, "Even if drama were not John's primary intention, its pattern influenced the book's literary structure and character. Drama provided an innovative medium for the setting of his writing. The Apocalypse displays the characteristics of Roman productions with the content of Greek compositions. Greek drama attempted to explain the factors that contributed to divine favor or disfavor and their consequences for the life of the community. For the Romans, plays served as one of the primary avenues to promote philosophical, religious, and political ideas." She begins with an image of the theater in the city of Hierapolis, which is about 10 kilometers north from Laodicea. Part of its stage has been restored, demonstrating several aspects we have already explored above. She imagines a three-level stage where an upper level represents heaven, a middle level represents the position of John the seer, and a lower level can portray the events happening on the earth. This lower level, she understands, would have a covered pit. Most intriguing here, perhaps, is her recognition of the contraptions used in Greek and Roman plays that would allow for actors to be lowered from above. They used machines, mechanae, comprised of elaborate booms and derricks to lower actors on the stage from above to enact the intervention, or infringement, of the gods into human affairs. A mechanism like this could assist in the portrayal of a winged flying eagle, for instance, as we have in 8:13, or a flying angel announcing the eternal gospel in 14 and verse 6. Whether or not one is impressed or compelled by these suggestions for a dramatic structure and or a dramatic scripting of the Apocalypse, what is clear from this discussion is that the historical context of Revelation's performance in relation to the Roman arenas and Greco-Roman theaters, the audience is swept into the dramatic portrayal of the cosmic affairs. Even more, with a brief introduction to the ideology of the arena and the architectural design of the theater, we can perceive a clarion call to respond to the seer's directorial guidance. In viewing the text in this way, we are forced to come to terms with some challenging questions. Where do we fit in the drama? In the masks of which characters will our faces be revealed? When we hear the hymns in chapters 15, 16, 19, we wonder, who can speak such stanzas? Who can sing the verses? When we watch from afar at the burning city of Babylon, who will sputter the dirges? Will we be able to answer the call of invitation to the marriage supper of the Lamb in 19, verse 9? The Apocalypse demands responsive action to the dramatic portrayal of the cosmic warfare between the deceptive dragon and the one who is called faithful and true in 19, verse 11. The combat in the arena between the beast and those who would follow the Lamb. Not entirely unlike the Roman arena, Revelation is staging a mythic performance that is rewriting the world and positing identities not only to these who are on stage, but also for the viewers in the audience. There is a projected theatricality that absorbs the audience into the action. A common notion in the Hellenistic world was the idea that all of life is a stage and every action was performed amidst an audience of onlookers. There has been a kind of dramatic turn in Christian theology that is commensurate with the Apocalypse's self-involving rhetoric that scripts the audience and exhorts it toward a particular ethos of bearing witness even unto death. The dramatic ethics of the Apocalypse call the Christian believer to a martyrological performance, following the Lamb and bearing witness to the truth of Jesus as God's self-giving, triumphant champion. Just as the two witnesses of Revelation chapter 11 found their identity in Old Testament paradigms of witness completed by the narrative script of the suffering, humiliated, yet resurrected and exalted Jesus, so the believers in the audience of every performance of the apocalypse are called to such faithful witness. Perhaps most notable for their contributions in this regard are the magisterial works of the Roman Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar in his Theodrama, and also the Reformed Kevin Van Hooser in his canonical linguistic approach to Christian doctrinal theology. Balthasar succeeds in a renovation of Christian theology and practice as the church participates in and lives into the dramatis personae of Christ. Balthasar understands the perception of the world stage, which requires a dramatic form to Christian living. This understanding moves the actor from understanding the role as a follower of Christ to participate in the mission. Christ is the model for the believer's life and also presents the promise of a pattern of restoration and glorification for the future that God is bringing. Samuel Wells, who provided for us the contrast between the models of the hero versus the saint in Lecture 9, suggests that Balthasar's appeal to drama, seeking for dynamism amidst the contingencies of incarnational faith, is itself too rigid. So, Wells proffers instead the model of improvisation, being shaped by the previous acts of the drama, but leaving room for the necessary spontaneity requiring for bearing witness in a changing world. However, Wells' constructive proposal is itself a vision that falls under the category of the theodramatic, and he likely does not give enough credit to Balthasar for the freedom and contingency afforded to God's people to perform their witness in their particular circumstances. What is required is a performance of martyr witness, persevering in faith until the end. What is most crucial for our purposes is to recognize the pattern that the apocalypse establishes for the ethos of the arena and the direction for the performance in the revelatory theater. Christ as the Lamb has conquered through suffering the violence of the dragon's schemes, and the path to victory for those who would follow the Lamb must trail along in the same path. If the audience of the apocalypse would hope to share in the Lamb's promise to share in Christ's authority over the nations, as he promises in 2 verse 26, and to share in a place with Christ on the throne in 3 verse 21, then we must embrace our martyrological role on the world stage. This may mean being fodder for the beast as it rampages through the theater before it meets its demise, but this too will beget justice. So that's the conclusion of part 1. This lecture will continue into part 2. Thank you.